Gardening has been through a fast pace of change over the past few years, with traditional ideas turned on their heads and common tasks re-evaluated. These have gone beyond fashion or early adoption to become important parts of the gardener's toolkit of the future. So, which lessons from the last year are we going to take to next year and beyond? It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And in this video, I'm pulling together the best advice from the expert garden designers, growers and gardeners that I've interviewed over the last year. These are practical ideas you can use whether you want to reduce the amount of water you use, save time or save effort, cut garden maintenance, or just be more wildlife friendly. I'll put links to the videos and the gardens and the experts in the description below if you want to find more about any of them. Possibly the first thing is gardening with less water. Now, there are a number of different approaches to this, but it used to be that if you wanted advice on gardening with less water, people would just say, oh, put a water butt in. But we've now got to the stage where the water butt or the water barrel is no longer the first or even the most important piece of advice you'll get. I went down to RHS Wisley to interview Janet Manning, who's the Senior Horticultural Advisor in Water Management. And I think you'll be surprised by where she started.
Janet, what do you think is the most important thing we need to think about when we're thinking about managing water for our garden?
Well, to be honest, I think it's soil, because the biggest reservoir we have is the soil right under our feet. We all talk about water butts, and water butts are great. You can never have enough water butts. But actually, if you can keep your soil really healthy, then it will capture more water for you. So when there's rain around, more of it will stay in the soil, and then you don't have to carry it around all the time.
Brilliant. So when you're saying in terms of looking after the soil, does that mean mulch?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you imagine all the little things that live in your soil, right from earthworms and springtails and all the bacteria and the fungi, all of that life needs water as much as your plants do. And those organisms are all breaking down that organic matter, and they are providing the nutrients for your plants as well. So it's a whole life system that needs the water as well. And when they do break that matter down, they produce these very sticky substances, and it's those sticky substances that then hold onto more moisture for you.
How much mulch do we need, and how often should we put it? And is there a particular kind of mulch that should be or shouldn't be in on top?
There's lots of reasons for mulching, not just water management, but actually mulch can suppress weeds. It will keep the root zone cooler because you've got like a layer of insulation. So there's lots of different materials you can use. Any homemade compost is great. Straw, dried herbaceous stems that have dried out, if you can chop them up a little bit, even better. Even lawn mowings, if you don't put too much on at once, you can use lawn mowings as a little bit of a mulch. Some people won't like the look of that, but it will very quickly get incorporated into the soil. But the only thing I would say is that if you can use a chunky mulch, so things like pine bark or the cocoa chips that you can find, then it's quite chunky and it's loose and it's big particles. And then the water will drain straight through that and get into the root zone where it needs to be. Whereas if you use something like your homemade compost or even multi-purpose compost, then it's really finely divided and it's designed to hold moisture. And then all you're doing is holding that moisture on the surface of the soil, and that's where it will dry out. So chunky bits on top, finer bits underneath, and then it works better because then the rain will go straight through the top layer.
In case you think you're going to spend a lot less time watering but a lot more time mulching, there are simpler and easier and quicker ways to mulch, and they'll be coming up later in this video. But now let's look at a couple of the other approaches to low water gardening, which is to grow drought-resilient plants in sand, gravel and rubble gardens. Let's start by talking to head gardener and award-winning author Tom Brown at West Dean Gardens, where he has created both a sand and a rubble garden.
Tom, this is a sand garden, in fact, and we're hearing a lot about gravel gardens now and how they're low maintenance and they're good for the environment and everything, and some people do contest that. But could you explain to me what a sand garden is and indeed what its benefits are? What kind of a gardener would want a sand garden?
Yeah, so I think sand, like rubble or recycled concrete, what have you, basically it's a very inert, free-draining media. So we're looking at growing plants with no fertility and no supplementary irrigation. So principally we're growing plants quite hard in this material. And here we've used a local sandstone, so it didn't have to travel very far, and from a budgetary point of view it wasn't as much as some of the builder's sand and some of the more processed sand. But we're creating a 10 centimetre layer to establish these plants, not only sort of hold the moisture during the summer, but also give us that free draining environment during the winter. Because where we always used to think that Mediterranean plants were our saviour, anything that would get through a hot, dry summer, the reality is we're also experiencing very wet, cold winters, and any sign of wet and cold, things like the cistus, the lavenders, they turn their toes up and die. So we're looking for a community of plants that are more resilient to climatic extremes. So quite often that will mean either a deep-rooted taproot, or perhaps something with quite a vigorous root system where it can cope with that.
And does the sand literally go on top of the soil, or is there some kind of a sub-base?
So our soil here is very flinty and chalky, so incredibly free draining. And the sand layer, we take a little bit of soil off because particularly with the sand garden that we've got here, there was hard landscaping that we had to work with. But we found a 10 centimetre layer is quite often deep enough not only to sort of suppress weeds but give plants that really good start. So we're on a very free draining soil here, so drainage is not a problem. But if people were looking at a heavier soil, a clay soil, I would recommend a sort of an experimental patch, because I haven't done this on a heavy soil, but I'm hoping that 10 centimetre is somewhat of a sanctuary, so plants can retreat back to that sand in particularly wet winters, and should be enough to then kickstart them to grow back into the clay come the spring and the summer. But if people did a couple of square metres in a part of their garden, see how it goes for a couple of years, and if it works, then they've got that confidence to sort of evolve it and spread it out. But a lot of this gardening is very instinctive and very experimental, so we've been doing it for about 3 years, and it's given me more and more confidence to look at those sort of traditional plantings and really question them, and growing them in mulch and irrigating them and staking them, etc.
In terms of planting the plants, are you planting them in the sand and then their roots go down into the earth below?
That's it. So if we're looking at 9 centimetre plants or 1 litre plants, which are often more economical to buy, the reality is that the top 2/3 of the root ball is coming into contact with the sand, and the bottom third is coming into contact with the soil below.
And then that starts it off, and it presumably keeps digging down to find the soil.
That's it. So some of these plants that are much deeper rooted, they tend to then go and anchor down and then find the water that they need. But the best analogy for people to try and sort of understand what's going on with this sand, because it's incredibly counterintuitive. You know, you think with a sand garden you're going to have to water it all the time. Actually, we don't irrigate it at all. If you've got a very hot sandy beach and you walk along that beach, it can almost be unbearable to walk on. But you start to bury your toes in the sand and it becomes very cool and damp very quickly. And that's the principle that we're working with. Actually, the particles of sand do hold moisture, and after the sand sort of caps, it helps to lock that moisture in. So what we feel is a very sort of dry, inhospitable medium to grow our plants compared to a well-mulched border, which we've got that analogy and that comparison. Actually, the available moisture is quite high, and where the sand reflects the light, it makes the rooting zone a lot more sort of hospitable for plants compared to a traditional border where there's a lot more air and gas and things dry out quickly.
So it protects the roots and it retains the moisture, and it keeps the weeds off?
It does. So that 10 centimetre layer, I would say to try and eradicate as many weeds as you can before you start a project, but that 10 centimetre layer is a sufficient mulch layer to suppress anything underneath. Where it sort of caps and crusts over, it's not so penetrable for weed seeds, and also the lack of humidity on the surface makes it harder for weed seeds to germinate. But if you do get any weeds that do germinate, they're so easily removed, and you've not got that muddy mess that goes with it. So it's actually, dare I say, a bit of a joy to weed in here if you can catch them early. So we find that little and often not letting things become a problem is a way to keep on top of things.
Town and city gardens can be hot, dry and full of leftover debris from building or previous gardens. So let's go over to the Horniman Museum and Gardens in South East London to find low water garden inspiration from the head of horticulture, Errol Fernandes. You're doing some quite interesting different sorts of things here. So I'd like to just go through them and then we'll work out how we could perhaps do them in our own gardens. So let's start off with what I would call the dry garden.
Yes, so we refer to that area that you're referring to as our xerophytic garden. All of the plants that are in that area are xerophytes, so plant species that have an adaptation to be able to cope with extreme weather conditions, in particular drought. So the project came about because in 2020 we launched a Climate and Ecology Manifesto, and that overarches everything that we do in the entire museum, so internally and externally with our 16.5 acres. And we had this area at the front of the museum. It's a real showpiece area, but it was looking a little bit tired. It wasn't unpleasant, but had phormium and bamboo. Some of those plants were running rampant and causing a little bit of damage with the paving. And we felt that there was an opportunity for some change. It was a south-facing area. It's really, really bright and sunny. There's very, very busy London roads, quite polluting, but also I feel perhaps even maybe a bit of a Gulf Stream effect of keeping that area almost like in a microclimate. And we've got this amazing sandstone frontage that retains heat as well. So there was a fantastic opportunity. We dovetailed that with a big pathway project that we had planned in the garden. And we knew that all the paths were going to be lifted and relaid. And the sub-base that would have normally gone to landfill, we retained all of that. So sort of crushed concrete, type 1 MOT, and it was about 15 tonnes of material. So rather than sending that material to landfill, we wanted to retain it in line with our Climate and Ecology Manifesto. So we essentially dug quite deep trenches and filled it with some of the bulkier materials, so big boulders and rocks. So essentially it's concrete boulders, really. And then mixed the spoil with the rest of the concrete, and then on the very top we've got concrete fines. So the material was sort of graded, but if you like, we were just taking it from a spoil heap of our contractor and using it, and being quite sort of particular about how we laid this on the ground in the area that we were doing. And we also just kind of played with the topography to create different little tiny microclimates. So on the north side, for example, you'd have sort of little shaded pockets, and in the south side there might be little dips that might protect something quite sort of cold sensitive. So things like Echium candicans, for example, that a little bit more fussy with the temperature in that location.
After gardening with less water, we come to gardening with less work. Although I will just drop in a word of warning from award-winning author James Alexander Sinclair.
I think that the important thing that everybody has to realise is that low maintenance is not the same as no maintenance. That's the most important thing, because people think, oh, low maintenance means they don't have to do anything, it means they have to go and hoover it every so often. And you can have a garden that does that, but it's basically concreted over.
So let's start with making mulching easier by talking to Anne Wareham, who, with her photographer husband Charles Hawes, has created Veda, which has recently been listed as one of the top 100 best gardens in the UK.
And in terms of the big jobs that people are always being asked to do, what are the ones that you would say gardeners can get away without doing?
Well, the one I really couldn't face originally, and people do quite cheerfully it seems, is cutting everything down in the autumn and carting it off to the compost heap to rot and then bring back again, which is, it seemed to me at the time I couldn't cope with doing it, and I've never done that. And what I do is I cut all this foliage down. I would tend to cut in the autumn, apart from a few things that get left till the spring, and the grasses always get left till the spring. But they just get cut down in pieces with a hedge trimmer or a strimmer and left in situ. And the benefits for the soil are enormous.
Yes, I think it's called chop and drop in the States.
It is now, yeah. It was Ruth Stout who was the first person that I came across who was doing this, mulching like mad, which is where I learned the value of mulch 38 years ago.
And Leave the Leaves has been a hashtag on social media for several years now, but it's now well and truly in our real lives. Both the London Parks and the RHS have put out advice to leave your leaves under trees and in borders or anywhere where people aren't going to walk, because the leaves will rot down into the soil and they'll return nutrients to the soil. They'll provide vital food for the microbes and worms that the soil need. And of course, it's less work for you. Personally, we've left our leaves on borders for years now, just because it was easier. And I've always found they rotted down quite quickly by spring. However, on the odd occasion where I have tried to bag up leaves and make valuable leaf compost, it seems to take ages before they decompose. Another way of allowing the garden to mulch itself, as it were, is to leave the traditional autumn clear-up until spring.
Professional gardeners are increasingly advising us to leave our seed heads over winter, and there are 3 reasons for that. Firstly, it's very good for wildlife. Birds feed on the seeds and insects shelter in the stems and the collapsing foliage. Secondly, it is beautiful. I know it's not as beautiful as a garden in full flower, there's no doubt about that, but it has its own rather austere and ghostly beauty, especially in low light or perhaps in the frost. And thirdly, it's less work. You will probably want to clear away eventually in early spring, but by that time quite a lot of the material will have rotted down and it will have collapsed, and it will have started working its way into the soil, improving the soil structure and increasing your fertility. And last winter we left this main border here completely during winter, and we didn't clear it away until early spring. And there's no doubt it looked messy, but actually it was a rather beautiful, natural mess. Well, obviously there are pros and cons to everything. And the one problem with leaving your seed heads over winter is you will get more self-seeders. Now, personally, I love self-seeders. You have to pull them out if they get too vigorous, but actually it's easier to pull a tiny plant out than it is to go all the way to the garden centre, buy new plants and plant them. So I love self-seeders.
Self-seeders, pioneer species and wildflowers are increasingly being seen as an environmentally friendly, low-work, low-cost alternative to great chunks of annual bedding flowers. For example, in RHS Chelsea, this was seen really quite widely. Now, pioneer species, as featured here in the King's Trust Garden by Joe Perkins, are plants which will self-seed themselves and survive in really difficult, harsh and hostile situations. And they often actually are the first plants to come along to colonise an area, and then they break down and they make the soil better for future plants to come along. In terms of wildflowers, the Kent Wildflowers stand was promoting the idea of growing wildflowers to put in borders to fill gaps, or indeed, as I have here, an entire border full of wildflowers. And this more relaxed attitude was also seen in lawns, although of course there are actually many more alternatives, particularly for smaller gardens, but we'll look at that later on in this video. Firstly, let's look at this lawn on Monty Don's show garden at RHS Chelsea, which he designed with Jamie Butterworth.
Relax about your lawn. You can have long grass, short grass, a mix of the two. It's your choice, but it doesn't have to be perfect. In this garden, which is Monty Don's RHS dog garden, they had a lawn because Monty Don said that dogs love a lawn, and indeed children love a lawn, and an open space also is a good foil for other more elaborate planting. But all credit to them, they did not make this a perfect lawn. It's quite shabby and shaggy. It's got weeds in it, and it's got neat edges, so it does show off the rest of the garden well, but it really does say you don't need a perfect lawn.
The next big theme that's come through the last few years is working with nature, not against it. Today's top gardeners embrace ideas that support wildlife and reduce intervention. We're also letting go of control as far as weeds and pests are concerned, and realising that even slugs and snails have some value to a garden's well-being. The RHS's State of Gardening report discovered that 80% of UK gardeners no longer use pesticides and weed killers. So getting rid of things is no longer a gardener's default. In fact, when I went to the RHS Hampton Court Flower Show, I actually saw brambles used decoratively in the main RHS sign, although I think it will be a while before they go mainstream. The idea of keeping garden waste, such as clipping, in your garden as part of the cycle of life is also growing. The RHS report of gardening said that 42% of gardeners in the UK don't send anything to landfill. In fact, most of this is composted, but the garden shows showed us some really interesting ideas of how you could use logs and garden clippings decoratively. They will slowly decompose, but very slowly, and they'll offer habitat and food to the microbes and fungi that the soil needs to stay healthy.
Moss is no longer something to get rid of. Of course, the Japanese approach to moss, as seen here in the Japanese tea garden, which won Best in Show, is beautifully curated moss balls.
But you could also see moss in a much more relaxed way on stones or around the water. But definitely, if you've got moss in your garden, hang on to it. And if you haven't got moss in your garden, I'm not quite sure how you create it, but keep an eye out for it. Another innovative idea from Errol Fernandes at the Horniman was the idea of tying up your grasses and seed heads at the end of winter rather than putting them into the compost heap. Let's find out why this is such a good idea.
And now let's think about the prairie garden.
Yes, so the prairie garden was designed in collaboration with Professor James Hitchmo in 2018, so before I arrived. And it's planted in 15 centimetres of gravel. And it's broadly North American and South African species. And that gravel sort of growing medium sort of keeps the crowns from rotting in the winter. So it's a really interesting planting. The changes that we've made are really about how we maintain this area. And it's important with the prairie garden that we cut and take away all of the material. And the reason for that is because these plants, being from North American and South African prairies, they would die if a soil layer developed around their crowns. And they'd die in the winter because that soil layer would hold moisture close to the crowns, and the crowns would rot and die in the cold and wet, the combination of the cold and wet through the winter. So we do this meticulous cutting and taking away to maintain that area, and we do that in the third week in March. Now, when we were doing some baseline studies with an ecologist recently, we were having a discussion about the maintenance of this area, and I'd become aware that the prairie garden buzzes with invertebrates through the summer, and they're not just feeding from those plant species. They make those plant species their home and their breeding ground. And all too often when we're cutting the material back in March, we find the hollow stems are filled with invertebrates, or underneath the echinacea seed heads, there'll be little clusters of ladybirds sort of sheltering from the cold. And it's too cold for these species to emerge at that point. And like so many gardeners, we cut that material back, we throw it on the compost heap, and we're turning all of that life into the compost. When discussing this with the ecologist, Johnny Johnson, he suggested we just leave it. Now, he's not a horticulturalist, and I can't leave it because these plants would die. So instead of cutting and taking away, we're now tying this material to posts, so that it's kind of, there's a clear message to the public, I think, in reading these sculptural kind of forms that we've got. They almost look a bit sort of paganistic, sort of somewhere where the witches have hung up their broomsticks or something. But essentially, it allows birds that are nesting at this time to take material. There's plenty of seed for the birds and other animals too, and all of those invertebrates that are overwintering in those hollow stems have the chance to emerge. Now, the key with our prairie garden is that those stands, those bundles of material, are taken away by mid-June, and that's because the prairie garden requires the full baking sort of sunlight and warmth. And if we leave them standing in place, there'll be a shadow on the north side that will impede the growth of the other plants in the prairie garden. So we must take them away. But each year we put them back, and it's had a fantastic response from the horticultural community in terms of resonance, really. I think a lot of people have sort of identified that bit as being a bit of an issue. The key is just making sure that we're not too quick to dispose of this material. Of course, we need to cut it back, and we've got a very clear reason for needing to cut it back, because we've got this gravel mulch. But of course, people want to tidy up their gardens in early spring, and that's fine. And of course, insects are in decline, certainly flying insects, and certainly in our cities. So it's really important that we make a space for them. But yeah, you could just create a teepee with some old hazel sticks or something and cram that full with cut grasses and hollow stems, and just pile it all the way up. Can look quite sculptural and beautiful. Or like we do, we've big hazel poles into the ground because they'll take a long time to rot. And we tie the bundles to those, and they stand in the border. And the response from our visitors is really positive too. People think they look really wonderful.
And not everything in 2025 was about something new. At times we looked back to reclaim what we had lost. I talked to Tony Hall of Kew Gardens and author of Gardening with Scented Plants about what's happened to fragrance in our gardens over the years and what we can do about it and why it's so important. When I came to Kew Gardens a couple of months ago, the winter garden, which Tony was responsible for, was absolutely looking gorgeous, but it was the scent that drew me in. It was amazing. And so I'm very excited to be back here to talk more about what scent can do in garden design. So Tony, start by telling me why you wrote this book.
There's a few reasons. One, I'm a beekeeper, so I obviously, like to have plants grown in my garden that are good for bees. But also, growing up, I remember how scented plants used to be. But nowadays, plant breeders tend to grow plants more for show, so they're bigger, more colourful, bigger range of colours. Some pest and disease, but there are fewer and fewer plants bred nowadays that are fragrant plants and plants that I can remember from my childhood. So it was really around that, to have a garden full of scented plants is amazing. I mean, it is lovely to have flowers that last longer, but the way the plant breeders have bred a lot of the plants now, they've kind of lost the scent for the longevity of the plant. So it was really to show people the wide range of plants all year round that you could have in your garden that are just wonderfully scented.
So how would you plan a scented garden if you were designing for scent? Because obviously you don't actually need every plant to be scented, do you?
Yeah, if you had a scented garden that would be just full of only scented plants, and there would be quite a lot of conflict, I would think, between all the different fragrances, and it might be completely overpowering. So I think the thing is you need to have a mixed garden, so a mixture of everything, annuals, bulbs, shrubs, perennial flowers, and have kind of mixed borders or mixed shrub borders where you just put certain plants in, whether they be dot plants, like Philadelphia, which will flower in April, May, and then it's gone, and then it can be followed by lots of other plants. I mean, there is a vast array of different ones. But I think the thing is not to have everything scented. You need to have a bit of a mixture.
And now let's look about how all these ideas have impacted garden design itself. If you look at these before and after pictures of this award-winning garden by Tomoko, Kawauchi and Charlotte Rowe of Charlotte Rowe Garden Design, you can see how the contemporary garden has changed dramatically over the last few years. Even in quite generous-sized town gardens, we're seeing less lawn and more planting, especially trees and ornamental grasses. So very much rethinking the garden as a design space.
A lot of architects just have a patio, come out of the house, particularly in Regency houses where they're again quite narrow and long and go up. Have a patio, then have this massive staircase up to the next level with no planting. So the garden is moving further and further away from the house. Whereas here, as you'll see when you walk round, this has been done in a completely different way with ramping. Do you want to talk about those a bit?
So this ramping in the middle area, we have a large planting bed. The idea was this group of plants flow into the terrace space, so almost invading into the stone area, so more harder surface. So the softness comes on like flat almost.
This trend away from lawns and into more planting was also seen at the RHS shows. An increasing number of people with small gardens are getting rid of their lawns, having more planting and only having hard landscaping where you need to sit or dine. But a solid chunk of hard landscaping can be expensive, it can get hot, and it's not very good for the environment. So there were quite a lot of gardens mixing, say, stone or pavers with gravel or with different types of gravel, and these were all demonstrated on the APL stand. That's the Association of Professional Landscapers, who of course would be the authorities on this sort of thing. And of course on their stand you had things like just using a short run of brick where you need some firmness, or a short run of decking, and then mixing it perhaps with wood chip. But with all this more relaxed and less controlled gardening, you do need some defined points to anchor the space. And one of the things I saw at a lot of the shows was clipped balls next to lush planting. So I went to Architectural Plants and asked Managing Director Guy Watts about what is a blobbery and why do we need one. So could you tell me what blobberies are?
We believe that we actually coined the term blobberies. It's something Angus used many, many years ago and was in our catalogue into the 1990s because it's that sort of formation of lots of plants together. Often they're wider than they are taller, which gives you that lovely sort of squashed ball look. And they are exactly that, they're blobs, but we then mix them together, so it could be different types of plants, different shapes, and they often merge together. So yeah, I agree, a blob to us is something that's very defined. It's beautifully clipped, often quite a lot, quite a few times a year, depending on the species.
And how would you use a blobbery in a garden design?
It could be underplanted a tree if you're using sort of shade-tolerant plants for a blobbery, or it could be in a very sunny position. Again, just as a sort of almost a piece of living art, a sculpture. You can add other elements to it that are perhaps deciduous, so you get pops of autumn colour, or viburnum tinus is a great plant to use in a blobbery because you get that lovely white flower in the winter.
And I think we've started to realise that we've got to think more carefully about our garden furniture. I talked to leading garden designers Joe Swift and James Alexander Sinclair, who have a podcast called the James and Joe Garden Show, and who write for the Garden Collective, about what the biggest mistake is that we make when we're designing our gardens.
Seating's really important, because otherwise you wander around and you end up going back to... So if you can dot some seating areas through, even if you don't sit on them, it just sort of mentally it gives you a sort of destination point. I think it works.
No, it's also seating is actually quite important. You should treat seating as sculpture quite often, because you spend much more time looking at it than sitting on it. Basically, so if you have a bench, make it a good bench. Make it a nice bench. Spend some money on it. Don't just have a plank and a couple of breeze blocks. It may work as somewhere to sit, but you need to have something that actually is part of the. It's like Joe was talking about, the sculptural parts of a small garden. The seat is part of it.
Really important, because actually it's very easy for people to just go out and just buy any old thing at a garden centre, but actually that's where you want to spend your money.
Think about it.
That's where clients sometimes, they like leave the furniture to right, and you've designed and made this lovely garden, it's all looking great, and then they'll go and buy some cheap white plastic furniture or something, and which just draws the eye. White is a very difficult colour in a garden, and you go back and well,
I'm not sure.
We might do the photos next week or something.
I'm not sure about plastic rattan.
No, I'm not sure about plastic rattan.
Because there's an awful lot of it around the place. These enormous sofas and things, trying to turn... I understand the idea...
for contemporary spaces.
Yeah, no, but not for everything. No. And you sometimes get them... So I have a very nice garden that I've done, and I arrived, and they've got a plastic rattan 3-piece bloody suite. And you think,
what
no...
colour?
Yeah. Well, it was a sort of
grey,
taupey mauve. Whatever it was a bad idea anyway. It shouldn't be allowed.
I know, but it's their garden. You see, this is the thing with clients, and but sometimes I say, "What do you think?" I've been thinking of getting this furniture, and it is a major feature. Actually, it's a big decision.
It's a big thing. So be careful. If we take nothing else from this, be careful of your furniture.
And with all this, there's an increasing sense that even professional gardeners who have to show their open gardens to the public are embracing realism rather than an idealised idea of a highly controlled garden. Let's listen to this advice by Asa Gregors-Warg, head gardener at the Beth Chatto Gardens.
I think I also need to say, because we've had one of the sort of hottest, driest summers for a while, and one can't really expect the garden to look as lush as it does in May and early June, sort of come July. And just because the plants are drought resistant doesn't mean that they are going to look as great and full of bloom perhaps in the middle of a heat wave, but they will recover.
And one piece of advice that I don't think we gardeners hear often enough comes from Jamie Butterworth.
What are the general principles of putting plants together? If you're going into the garden centre, you've got your trolley. What do you do?
Buy my book.
Absolutely.
No, joking aside, I've been gardening and playing with plants my entire life, and I work with garden designers and the most amazing planting designers, and I have the luxury of doing projects, everything from Chelsea Flower Show with Monty Don through to working on the nicest domestic gardens and everything in between. So I think slowly but surely over time I've worked out what plants I think both grow well together, because you're looking at two for it. They've got to look good together, but they've got to physically be able to grow well together and survive together. So I think the first one is don't get overwhelmed, plants will die. I've been doing this my entire life, and I work with people that have been doing it for far longer than I have, and fundamentally plants die. And we need to be okay with that and accept that some things will work, some things won't, and actually the things that don't work provide us with an opportunity to plant something else in there. It's very similar in cooking to many ways, but also a little bit more difficult in that it might take 6 months for you to know if you've actually got it right or not. But not being afraid of it not working, I think, is the first hurdle to overcome.
So what were your favourite gardening ideas of 2025? If I look at my viewing figures, it looks as if Tom Brown's sand garden was your absolute favourite. So I'm bringing it up next. But let me know if there were other things that you thought we are really going to do for the future. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.